Like I got a couple of big boxes in there, Vanessa.
Today's Monday, September 9th, 2019. We have a delivery from UPS, as you see.
Yes, it's been about 2 weeks in the coming. No big problem, I think it would be. Yeah. It's got optical equipment in it, so we do want to be careful. Okay.
So how many boxes do you think there are?
Well, as a telescope, there's the mount, there's the tripod, the eyepiece, and the finder scope. These are massive. These are the counterweights for the equatorial mount. Sheer lead.
Bill.
Just
No, they already paid for it.
No, I mean, what's in it? Because we want to count up so many pieces. We should make sure that we got the right requisite number of boxes and things. I got plenty to do. All these boxes have to be disinterred. The entire scope assembly with the mount and everything has to be put together. Then it has to be optically checked to make sure there's no damage to any of the optics or the mechanics. Should be fun. It's September 9th. It's a long ways from Christmas, but I have a lot of packages to open. I suspect this first box is going to have what is called a counterweight in it. The kind of mount that this telescope is going to ride on is called an equatorial mount. And in an equatorial mount, you have to have a certain amount of weight opposite the telescope to keep everything in balance. The mount I got was a Losmandy G11 Gemini. That's a single weight that'll go on the opposite side of from the telescope on the axis. So each of these weights has a little screw that mounts it onto the bar of the shaft. Looks like I got plenty of them. This is a used Losmandy mount, and it was used for what is called imaging. And in astronomical imaging, you set up a CCD imager along with a laptop and other control devices and monitoring devices so that you can actually capture long-term exposures of the sky. This is the main counterweight. Probably weighs about 20 pounds. And then you use these other smaller ones to fine-tune the balance. Okay, so box number 1 and box number 2 open, the smallest two. This box is probably going to contain the tripod. And the tripod is the basis of the mount that makes contact with the earth and holds the rest of the assembly up so that you can be in a reasonable position with your body ergonomically so that you can look through the eyepiece of the telescope, or in the case of an imaging, a CCD imaging camera that mounts where the eyepiece ordinarily would go. So, this thing is fairly well taped up. So, a bit of a struggle here. Let's get it open. Here we go. Use a little muscle as well as some edge. Like Losmandy, the company I got the scope from, went to some trouble to make sure this was well packed. And we got all this popcorn in here, styrofoam packing material, which is going to probably want to distribute itself throughout the living room. So I'm going to dig through this and we'll come back and show you in a minute or two what's inside this. So this is indeed the tripod, and this is a very, very robust tripod for this mount. This tripod itself can extend to various heights by telescoping the legs. Probably weighs about 15 pounds in and of itself. One reason why I have to take this all apart now, I have to assemble this telescope just to make sure everything works, especially the optics. Right here I have 4 almost identical boxes. I'm sure they're going to all mostly contain other elements of the tripod and mount, like the equatorial mount itself. Let's see what's behind box number 1. You have an eyepiece tray that sits in the mount so you can put your eyepieces on it. And another part of the mount. This part of the mount undoubtedly fits in to the tripod unit here. Now, I have no experience with this particular mount, so I'm going to have to puzzle through it. We'll have a look over time, and if I can't figure it out for myself, I can probably ignore the instructions and go online to YouTube. This is probably an extension to the tripod, but we'll take a look. Hard to access, been well wrapped. Thank you, Opcorp. Opcorp is a telescope supply company. I think they also do some manufacture. And they are out of the town of Carlsbad, California. I originally contacted them because I was looking for a specific telescope, a 140 millimeter apochromatic refractor. But in doing further research, the 140 Tech proved to be a bit more expensive. I was willing to pay for, so I found another option, which we'll reveal a little bit later. Okay, nothing left in this box. Now we're on to box 2 of the 4 identical boxes. And we found in the last one that there was the eyepiece tray, as well as one of the axes of the mount, either that or an extension. As I said, I'm not familiar with this particular model of an equatorial mount, although I've done a lot of observing with equatorial mounts. This is a used mount. As I mentioned, it had been used largely by Peter at Optical for imaging purposes, meaning that he had to have a very fine mount with a minimal amount of error in tracking so that you could get long-term exposures with the CCD imager. Whoop. This is the key element of an equatorial mount. Basically, what you do is you dial in an equatorial mount so that it points directly at the North Pole with what is called the declination axis. And from that point on, if you perfectly align the declination and right ascension axes with the mount with the North Pole, your telescope will track the stars as they move across the heavens due to the Earth's rotation. Clearly, this baby drops in here after I extend these retaining fasteners a little bit. So far, so good. So that's box number 2. We're now on to box number 3 of the 4 identical box series. Remembering that I had already opened up a box that had to do with the tripod, and then another one, 2 that had the counterweights in it for the equatorial mount. I have to admit, I was a little bit concerned about the mount because I thought it might be a bit too massive and heavy. But we'll see when it gets it all assembled. Ideally, a mount like this, you can carry, one person can carry all by themselves and set it up without the telescope on the mount. And then once they get the mount set up, they can bring the telescope out and attach it to the mount. So now box number 3 of the 4 identical set series. And here we go. This is probably, looks like it's got a drive mechanism on it. It's also got a right ascension or axis. So I'm going to have, and it probably will mount as part of an extension of the equatorial head that I just showed you. It looks like there's a place for it here, like this. That's how that will fit on there at some point. I'm going to set it right here. So more of the mount in box number, identical box number 3. Now we're on the identical box number 4. We may very well have every component of the mount already. There's some other components that I ordered from Optical that included a finder scope, an essential accessory to a telescope that makes it possible for you to get low power views of the sky so you can point your telescope in the specific direction of any particular study in space that is on your observing plan, or if you're just if you're just doing stargazing, which means no plan whatsoever, you'll be able to direct it towards anything that happens to capture your fancy. So let's see what's in here. Well, right off, this is a box within a box. Likely to be either an eyepiece, probably the eyepiece, but it could be the finder scope. I had to order one eyepiece, although I already have several in Tucson, Arizona, because I needed to be able to check the optical quality of the scope. As it turns out, it's the finder scope in here. And that itself has sub-assemblies which have to be put together. But the idea being that as I put these things together, you'll be able to follow along with me. So there's the finder scope, and it will mount on the main optical tube assembly into what's called a dovetail bracket. And you'll look through this eyepiece, sight along the telescope, on the side of it a little bit, get the general position, then look down through the eyepiece. It'll have a reticle in it, and you'll be able to center a particular star, usually a brighter star initially, in order to astro-navigate to the study what some astronomers call objects that they want to observe through the main telescope. And here, well, let's have a look. Probably, maybe it's an eyepiece case. Also well wrapped. And a little difficult to get at with the tape. Hefty scissors help. Get this bubble wrap. Once again, it's not Christmas. There's no Santa Claus on this. It didn't need to be Christmas. Ah, it could be a battery. Oh, it's okay. Right here, what we have is the ports to be able to control the mount. This mount has several interesting features. It has the ability to go to, which means after you do a multi-star model of the heavens as they are at the time of night you're out, you can go and you can talk to the telescope and tell it to go anywhere you want. I'll talk more about this later. All right, somewhere down here, an eyepiece, the one and only eyepiece that I ordered for the scope. This eyepiece was essential. I selected an eyepiece that would give me exactly 1 magnification for every millimeter of aperture. The telescope, as you will see later on, has an objective of 6 inches or 150 millimeters. And I had to select an eyepiece with a focal length, and I'll explain how that works later on, that related to the focal ratio of the aperture. With the aperture, that would give us 150x. And that means an exit pupil of 1 millimeter. Well, all of this is very mysterious and may not make any sense right now, but I'll explain some of these parameters and aspects of telescopy and astronomy later, why you'd want them. Looks like it comes in a nice little bag. I have to spread it open a little bit. And here we go. Should be an 8 millimeter. Focal length, which allows your eye to see the image projected by the telescope as though your eye was only 8 millimeters away from it. Comes with lens caps. It's got a 68-degree field, and that means this eyepiece at 150x will show should easily encompass the full moon inside for viewing at 150x. So here goes the eyepiece. Let's set it over here. Okay. Okay, one other thing in box number 4 of 4 of the same shape, size, is the bracket to be able to mount the telescope onto the mount. Very critical component. So I may discover after I get what I thought was everything out that there's a few things missing, and I'll have to go back through those boxes later on in order to dig for them. But I'm glad I checked this one out. So this is part of the mount assembly too, and mates, the main event. Do a quick check through here to the mount, which is what is called the optical tube assembly. You'll notice some hints about what's in here. Fragile, handle with care, do not drop, because it has critically aligned optical components in it. This is the foundation of all your planning. What's in here, you have to really think about before you go and put a telescope assembly together. And that basically is what type, what size, what focal ratio, what optical performance, what kinds of objects you want to observe in the night sky, or studies as I call them. All of these things have to be considered before you make a choice regarding what's in this box. Based on what's in this box and the kind of observing you want to do will determine everything else in the telescope assembly, which includes the mount assembly, the complexity of the electronics, how much weight that mount can bear. Every other object, every other thing that's going to be part of your telescope assembly is based on what's in this box. And what's in this box is pretty well boxed up itself, and because of its critical nature, has its own carrying case. This is a Skywatcher telescope. It's manufactured, you'll want to come to this side, I think, Vanessa, by a company called EcoStar. Struggling to open it. This is the optical tube assembly of a 150 millimeter or 6-inch semi-apochromatic refractor. Now there's reasons why it's a semi-apo, because it has, the lenses in this are designed to correct somewhat, but not perfectly, for the fact that in a refractory telescope, short wavelengths and long wavelengths of light, for instance, violet, which is a short wavelength, and red, which is a long wavelength, do not precisely come to the same point of focus. You can buy very expensive telescopes of this size for tens of thousands of dollars that are fully apochromatic, which means the red and the violet almost come to perfect focus together in the eyepiece. Or you can buy much cheaper versions of this telescope called achromats. And they have a hard time of integrating the violets and the reds. This is on the spectrum in between. It uses a special kind of low dispersion glass. And what that glass does is it does a better job of the flint crown achromats, but not as good a job as a fully corrected objective lens, which is located up here. So this is kind of a balance between the two. It balances out expense and optical performance, but its optical performance should be very satisfactory compared to most other telescopes. Okay. The key feature of this type of telescope is the fact that once I get it out of the box and I give you a chance to look at it, the objective lens, you'll see that there's nothing blocking any of the light going into this telescope. Every form of telescope that is not of a very special design, either a refractor or what is called an off-axis Newtonian telescope, has some kind of obstruction in the middle of the field. And the obstruction causes the clarity and the contrast of the image to begin to fall apart. So the images get soft. Stuff doesn't look as sharp as it might. So once you get a new telescope assembly, whether it's new or used, and this is the Evo Star, 6-inch. Now the first things to check is how smoothly the focuser works. This one is not very smooth. Now there may be some adjustments I can make. This is called gross focusing. And unfortunately it seems to bind. And in binding it makes focusing very difficult. So I'm going to have to look at the mechanics of this. The focuser and the optical tube assembly is set up to accommodate 2-inch eyepieces. And the one I purchased can be used on either a 2 or 1.25-inch eyepiece. But I'm not very satisfied with this motion, and I'm going to have to look into it. The other thing you want to check is at this end of the telescope, and is by far the most expensive aspect of the telescope, is called the objective lens. And as soon as I get this plastic off here, we'll have a look at it. So I've peeled back enough of the coating, shipping material, wrap material, so that now we can look down inside the optical tube assembly. But obviously we're not going to get a very good view because the dew shield is blocking the light, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. But there it is. The dew shield itself was threaded on. It took maybe half dozen, no more than 10 quarter-turn rotations to remove it. And now we can get a look at the optical element. It's called the primary objective. You can see the primary objective lens inside here, and if you look at it from certain angles you can see it's coated. And the reason it's coated is to remove internal reflections, so that if you're looking at something bright you'll see multiple instances of it at different positions of the field of view. The coating is intended to prevent that. Also, more obviously, you want to look for any damage, and I'm not seeing any cracks. We're coming out of the eyepiece end of the scope. We peer along it with the camera. You can see the internals. Let's see if we zoom in on it, what we get. You can get a better sense of any flaws in the primary. Now the primary on this is a 2-lens system. One lens is used to spread out the waveforms coming from the stars and planets, etc., and the other is to bring it to a focus. And the combination of the two results in as many of the colors, especially on the red to violet spectrum, coming to a common level of focus as possible. Original telescopes only had a single objective lens. Then they created the crown flint achromat sometime in the 18th century. And then they started developing exotic glasses that they could use to fine-tune it. The result over time with the objective lenses and refractors is basically just to shorten the telescope, because you could get really pretty good optical performance if you had an insanely long achromat. But amateur astronomers don't want such a wieldy assembly. So over time, by coming up with exotic glasses and lens geometries, they were able to shorten the telescope up. So this 6-inch telescope probably gets the optical at about 1200 millimeters, which is about 48 inches, gets the optical performance of a 6-inch refractor that was an achromat without all the exotic glasses and geometries that was more than twice this length. So there we have it. Having replaced the dew shield and the lens cap, so far when I'm looking at the scope, my greatest concern is how chunky and clunky the focuser is. It takes a great deal of effort, and as a result of the great deal of effort, micrometric control of the focus is challenged. I'm going to remove this cap from this side. And there we have one saving grace, is we have, not only do we have coarse focusing on this scope, we also have fine focusing. And you know, just by removing that silly cap, the motion of the coarse focuser is better. Quite acceptable, actually, especially when you're given the fact that you have a fine focuser as well, and that's quite fluid. So the next step for me is to pull the mount together, mount the telescope on the mount, and assuming I have a view of the night sky tonight, there is a westering Jupiter at a very low sky position, unfortunately. There is a Saturn, and there'll be some overhead stars, so I'll be able to check the optical performance at that time. That's my project of the day.
Oh yeah? Does it have something to do with that?
Has something to do with that. Now, Michael is not an amateur astronomer. Probably never had an interest in looking in the sky in her life. Is that in your life? Is that true?
Oh no, I used to want to be an astronomer.
You wanted to be an astronomer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is all the stuff I have to pull together. This is the mount assembly.
That looks like a sextant from me.
Yeah, it does. It's very heavy duty, and I have a lot of parts to pull together to get it to work right. And this is what goes on the mount, right over here.
Looks expensive.
It's it could be considered expensive. I could have bought something better than that of equal size for about $6,500. Didn't spend that much for this. But it should. I'll tell tonight when I take it out and get it on the mount. If we get some stars tonight, I'll be able to tell how good it is optically.
Yeah.
I have confidence it's going to have pretty decent performance.
For sure.
So, but you can see how if we were to get the right building,
Yeah.
that we would have a pretty good setup for John Day Carpe Noctem Observatory, wouldn't we?
Mm-hmm. I can't see anything.
No, you can't, because right now there's a little telescope in here that allows you to line up on Polaris, so you can set the mount up properly so that it tracks really well during the night.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So that's my project of the day. You can see all kinds of parts all over the floor, and they all have to come together, and I have to figure out how to do it, and I'm going to do it without looking at instructions, nor am I going to go on YouTube, because I know enough about how all this should work that I should be able to pull it together.
Gotta make sure this is level too.
Yep, level is a very important principle.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my project. And yours?
Paint a house.
Thanks, Mike. The first mystery I have to solve with this mount is how to get these legs to lock. But I'm thinking that basically they auto-lock when you drop them down. And what I mean by that is, as soon as you drop the legs all the way down, the weight of the mount itself causes them to latch in some way. At first I was thinking I have to use some kind of a tool to tighten that up, but no, I don't think so. There's no head on that for me to adjust in any way to tighten, put tension on it. I hate to make a false assumption here about this because obviously once you get the telescope all set up, if this thing were to not have complete and perfect stability, and it doesn't seem to demonstrate it on this one leg, you're going to find yourself sinking with possible damage to the scope, optical tube assembly. So I have to figure out, how do you lock these legs? Oh, a little guesswork, and I assume this fastener, one of these fasteners that holds the mount extension, would be useful in holding the leg of the mount in position. So I screwed it in, and there she goes, it's stable. The question now becomes, what happened to the 3 for the tripod? Which of course leads me to the fact that I'm probably going to have to dig through the boxes again. They'll probably be in there in a package, so that's my next step. First step in my quest for the 3 missing fasteners was the tripod box. Unfortunately, after emptying its entire content, nada. Also look through all the loose various and sundry parts I have on the floor, and there's no fasteners there either. And of course, there's no reason to look through the optical tube assembly case because that was packed by Evostar, not by OpCorp. Then leads me to identical box series 1 through 4. Let's have a look. Here we go, in box number 4, these levers. And I suspect the threading is precisely the same as the knobs. So, as of this point, I would say I have all the parts to pull this baby together, so I'm going to get on it. So because I'm doing an initial setup and I just want to check some things out, I remove this extension tube that goes on the tripod so I have good access to the equatorial mount. Now this part of the equatorial mount actually has a little telescope on it, and I've actually got it pointing in the direction of due north from here. What you do is you sight along in here and then you find Polaris. You compensate for the fact that the North Star isn't precisely over the North Pole of the Earth, extended into the sky, and then that helps you to get the telescope preset. Notice also this mount has, before I mounted this up, there were some levelers available to me so I could set the leg lengths properly to get a nice, flat, perfectly planar base for the mount head. In fact, walking to the far side of the mount from the one I was on, here's the actual leveling bubbles. And a slight amount of adjustment still needs to be done. Initial adjustments is to set the declination to your actual latitude. And here we go, I'm dialing it in, and we're at about 44 degrees north latitude. Notice how I do that with this big knurled knob after loosening up. So I'm going to set it right about there. That's right on 44 degrees north latitude. That's an initial set point, by the way. As currently assembled, this mount will not support the telescope. All we have now is the declination axis. We need something that'll spin on what is called the right ascension axis. And that's this unit down here. And if you look at the far side of it, it's got this house-shaped hexagonal indent. And that basically is captured by this, so that we now have both the declination and right ascension. So the right ascension is mounted in the one fit only location on the capture. Then you have these knurled knobs, very beefy, to lock it in place. Okay. Meanwhile, for doing the actual alignment to the pole star, I'm compensating for the time of year. You have to remove this knob on the top, which allows the small telescope inside to view Polaris. Now, I'm mounting the eyepiece tray. And typically you'll use 3 or 4 different eyepieces with any telescope. The eyepieces have a focal length designed to show you the image magnified at a range of magnifications. Typically, you want at least one eyepiece that will give you a good 1-degree field. And on this telescope, that would be about 60 or 70x, but since it's a refractor, these refractor telescopes are especially good at wide field views, so you want to have even lower magnification than that. To determine what your lowest magnification is in an eyepiece, you divide the aperture of the scope by the number 7, which is the widest your pupils will get in your eyes to accept an image. And in this case, 150 divided by 7 is about 25x. To get a 25x view through this telescope, though, you'd have to have one huge honking eyepiece. And my longest is 35 millimeters. So that's going to be above 25x. But imagine a 25x view on a clear, perfect, dark sky covering over 2 degrees of the heavens. You will see a magnificent spray of stars, nebula, galaxy clusters, etc. through a telescope that's able to give 2-degree fields. So far, the only tools I've had to use at this point to assemble this mount has been a 1/4 inch Allen key. You can see it here. Anyway, that's necessary to mount the interface plate, the telescope mounting plate, to the top of the right ascension axis. And that's been it. You'll notice that this has a race along it. That allows you to slide the telescope for perfect balance. And as you use different size eyepieces, or if you add cameras and things to your telescope, you need to be able to do that so the telescope remains in balance, proper balance front to back as well as side to side. However, all you adjust with this is front to back balance. So the best way to mount the telescope is not to mount it with all this heavy equipment on it. What you want to do is put it inside these huge C-clamps here. But you want to mount that part of the scope first. So this is what the telescope looks like. It's a Skywatcher Evo Star 150 low dispersion. ED means low dispersion. So what I need to do now is remove the telescope from its mounting mechanism so I can put the actual mount with the clasps onto the equatorial mounting plate first, and then place the telescope inside of its clamps. Okay, you'll notice these knurled knobs on the side. They are the clenching knobs so that I can reposition the mounting assembly for the telescope at any position to create balance easily during the course of changing eyepieces if they happen to be rapidly different. Now, I also happen to have a bino viewer, which means that the weight on the back of the telescope will increase considerably when I go to bino view the heavens. So this ability to adjust the front to rear balance of the telescope is critical when you have optics that includes bino viewers or heavy cameras. Notice also that I've set the clamps so that they drop to the far side, allowing me to lift the telescope from the western side of the telescope and place it on there. It could be done either way, it just so happens to be my initial preference. Now the mount is useless without the telescope. And the telescope is useless without the mount. Probably the most critical phase of the operation is to actually mate the scope to the mount, and that involves dropping it in here and clamping it down. Now, first off, I want you to notice there's no counterweights on this thing yet, so I certainly don't want to do anything to move the telescope out of the polar aligned position, because it is not weighted, counterweighted. So right now, I want to make sure everything's tight here. The telescope will not flop over. Now see how easily it would flop over? There actually is no, I don't believe there's a way of trapping it. So I may have been premature in mounting the telescope. All right, and I don't recommend not having the counterweights in place. But let's imagine if it does flip, what happens to the scope? It gains weight, and it would easily slam against the side of the mount. So what I'm going to do is remove the telescope right now, but you did see how it mounts. So now I'm going to carefully back off, and at this point I'm just going to slide the entire slide assembly out of the telescope. And I can tell instantly this thing is front heavy because it has no eyepieces on it. I'm going to set it down here. Next phase is to add counterweighting to the equatorial mount. So now I'm adding the counterweight extension rod. If I were to have to use counterweighting right at this point here, it would be massively heavy. You wouldn't want to have such a heavy weight here to counterbalance the telescope, but by putting the counterweights way down here on a sliding rod, not only can you use a lighter weight, but you can adjust the weight depending upon the weight of the telescope. Because this mount will support anything from like a 6-inch refractor all the way up to like a 14-inch, probably supposed to support a 200-pound telescope optical tube assembly with finder and everything else. So you could easily mount a 14-inch SCT on one of these Losmandy G11s. So I'm going to start with this heaviest counterweight. I'm going to slide it up the rod a little bit. Say right there. Because right now it's going to support the lightest telescope possible. And all you do is you ease it down until you find a weight that just counterbalances the telescope. Over here. Remember I said the telescope is too heavy in the front. Well, what I'm going to do is just stick an eyepiece in the back. Unfortunately, I did not get a diagonal with this scope because I already have one back in Tucson. So I'm only going to be able to do straight through viewing with the one eyepiece I have. So this is the eyepiece, one eyepiece of many. It's an 8mm, gives 150x view with this telescope. And ordinarily you'd have the lens caps on it and you'd set it in the most balanced position possible on the eyepiece tray. What I'm going to do is remove this eye cap, and I'm going to insert the eyepiece into the focuser assembly, and I'm going to tighten it down. Now it's going to have to come way out, which is what it is, in order to come to focus without a diagonal, which would add several inches to the focal length of the telescope. So I'm going to put it right about there initially. Then I'm going to lift it up. And where I'm lifting it is right next to this base plate rod for mounting the telescope. I can still feel it's a little heavy on the front, but there's other things that need to go on this, such as a finder scope. So the finder scope goes in this little dovetail right here, which is part of the optical tube assembly, focuser assembly, and it goes in just like that. Now notice, remember I mentioned a diagonal before? Well, this little finder scope, which is a 50mm refractor of about 10 magnification, has a diagonal on it. That makes it easy for you to line up the stars a little better, so you don't have to actually put your eye right here. Now you can put it there. I'm going to check. Now remember how to check the weight again. Lift it. It's still a little front heavy. Now the lens cap here has actually got some weight on it too. So if I really wanted to balance this baby out a little bit, I'd loosen this up and I'd slide it carefully, slide it backward, maybe a 1/4 of an inch. I'll flip this here and here, and I'll slide it back. Okay? Put the C-clamps back on it. Make sure I put the washer on the correct side. Latch it down. Do another quick check. And the balance is getting better. I'm not worried about it. I'll perfect it once it's on the mount. Now this time I'm going to mount the telescope with the mounting plate in place. Now this is a very critical operation. You want to be really careful. And the only way it can be done is to get the little thing's engaged on both sides, and then walk it up, slide it along till the plates line up, and then tighten these clamps, making absolutely sure this telescope assembly will not don't let gravity strike again. Make sure it's well captured. Okay, now we pretty much got this thing assembled. Got the counterweight in place, the equatorial mount. One of the things that you want to be aware of is for certain kinds of observing, you will want to use this mount extension, the vertical mount extension, because the telescope is limited in its ability to see overhead, because you'd have to rotate the telescope. Now notice I'm also checking my balance. See, the telescope is more heavy than the counterweight because it's drifting down like that. So I release the counterweight, slide it down an inch. Now I should be able to push like this in either direction, and the amount of travel is the same. I'm getting very close on this, aren't I? Notice also I have not captured this counterweight yet. You want to be absolutely sure to put this screw back into the end of the counterweight shaft, because that's what allows you to make sure this will never slide off. Okay? So now, notice if I rotate it, wow, that's pretty good. It moves smoothly. Look at that. In fact, if you have your telescope perfectly balanced, you never have to clamp anything in place while you're observing. You can always push the telescope in any direction you want to go. Now notice there's an imbalance here. Notice it wants to continue, the front part of the telescope wants to continue rotating down. Did you see that? That's because the telescope is still too heavy in the front where the objective lens is. I have to slide the optical tube assembly back towards the eyepiece position. Notice it's still dipping towards the objective lens. I had moved it about 1/4 of an inch. I have to move it back towards the eyepiece, further even. That involves loosening these clamps and then walking the telescope back a little bit. Here we go again. Okay, still tilting. It doesn't want to walk in that direction, it wants to walk in this direction. We're still objective lens heavy. Let's try it one more time. I could go on for hours with this, right? To get it just perfect. But you get the idea. Okay, so now you'll notice if I give it a push, it arrests its motion in that direction. And if I give it a push, it arrests its motion in this direction. It's quicker to arrest its motion in this direction, which means I'm still a little too heavy on the front. But I'm not going to worry about it, because as you extend the focuser, that also changes the weight distribution of the telescope. So this is good enough for the time being. Right now I've positioned the telescope so it's looking at the zenith, directly overhead. Notice the eyepiece position down here. Without a diagonal, can you imagine how excruciating it would be to have to observe like that? All right, so with a diagonal on it, like is on this finder scope, you wouldn't have to get that low. But if you were doing a lot of overhead observing, you'd also add this extension, which would add about 16 inches to it. So now the diagonal would be here instead of there. And you could easily sit on a little low observing stool to observe right overhead. But although observing right overhead is the best because the sky is clearest, darkest overhead, most of the time you won't observe on the zenith. You'll be observing at angles kind of like this. And tonight, hopefully, when I get a chance to star test this telescope, if the conditions are appropriate, I will be looking at stars, or certainly the planets will be at an angle like this, Saturn and Jupiter. But I will find stars that are probably at about this angle, which means I can star test the telescope, getting me on my knees. Okay, before I sign off on this part, the assembly portion, I want you to point out a few things. When I've got the telescope oriented mostly to go right to Polaris, I've got the focusing knob set right here before me. That'll probably give the best overall performance as I swing the telescope to different parts of the sky. This finder scope should also be set in that position. It does not mean it can't be reset. It's just a good initial starting position to be in. And when I'm actually aiming at things, I'm going to look along the top of the telescope to get a general orientation, switch to the finder scope, and finally the eyepiece. So, part 2, hopefully, will cover setting it up in the backyard. And you're not going to be able to see much as it gets dark in the camera, but I'll be able to give you an idea of what you're looking for when you star chest. Hopefully, I'll actually be able to line this handheld video camera or another one up with the eyepiece so you can get an idea of what I'm referring to. Adios!